Hey, Deborah, thanks for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. You recently, or maybe not so recently, but you got your PhD in depth psychology, and you're now working as a coach and an author and a podcaster, dose of depth. But today we're going to be chatting about some of the, underlying themes of a Jungian approach to a person and what that means and how we can kind of live our lives under that sort of a framework. And your book, it's called Your Soul is Talking, Are You Listening? And I think that sort of perfectly encapsulates the discussion that we're going to have today. So thank you for coming on.
Thank you. I'm excited.
Yeah, me too. So maybe let's sort of just start off with a little bit of groundwork. When you talk about a soul, right, it often has a lot of connotations and it means different things to different people. In this context, what does it mean to you in this framework?
I actually spend a whole paragraph in my book talking about soul because soul can't be pinned down. And I say that souls can be a noun, a verb, an adverb, an adjective. And I think it's just like this piece of you that is not easily seen. Mm-hmm. It's like, and it also transcends you as a person. So I feel like there's this like thing in the background. You could call it yourself. Jung would call it a capital S self. But then that's also part of like a whole cosmic self and soul. So I guess what's most useful about how you look at soul is how does it help you find meaning in your experience of being a human being, as opposed to just interpreting or having a conversation about, well, I think it means this, I think it means that. For me, it all comes down to how you look at soul as a way to help you make meaning of your unique experience of being a human being.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's kind of like this, ethereal or ephemeral force that sort of resides within us that we kind of know is there and often speak about, but it's really hard to describe conceptually.
Yeah, and I think the realm of soul is the realm of the feminine as well. So if we look at the masculine as more, ego-oriented and straightforward and linear and clear and direct, soul and the feminine are not those things. Mm-hmm. The feminine is full of paradox, and it's not linear, and it's sneaky, and it's strategic, and it's interrelated and interdependent, and that can really frustrate the masculine part of us. So soul also requires patience, and communicating with soul requires learning a different kind of language, a language that feels mysterious, but once you kind of learn a framework, and it's not even a specific language, it's more of a framework for communicating with soul.
Right. And just to be clear, the sort of masculine feminine thing is this idea that within each of us there are these at least two opposing principles that work to varying degrees for each people, much like many other things that exist on a somewhat of a dichotomous spectrum, and they bring different things to the table, the yin yang, the light and dark, like those kind of dimorphous understandings of things. And so it's interesting that you say go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that I think it was Jung that said this, that the feminine and masculine can be looked at as styles of consciousness. So approaches to taking in information and finding meaning in it. So, and of course, we're having a lot of conversations these days about gender and feminine and masculine. And for depth psychologists, we don't attach the feminine and masculine to gender. That happened to have happened, we look at it more as these styles of consciousness, and the goal is really to develop a capacity to know when to use which one and when to use them in partnership.
Right. So it's that we all have both, and depending on how we use them depends on sort of how our relationships and interactions and perceptions of the world will change. And if it's not working, if our current sort of way of approach isn't working so well or causing us problems or things like that, then maybe it's, you know, a good idea to kind of look at other ways of doing it, right? Different way of understanding.
And that was my whole midlife unraveling had to do with my relationship with my feminine.
What do you mean?
Well, I came of age in the 1980s. So for women, this was a time that we felt like we were beginning to break through barriers. So in my 20s, I saw the first woman become a partner of a major law firm. There were a lot of firsts. But in order to get into those systems, you had to adapt to the culture that was in those systems. So you sort of had to leave a part of you behind. But it was okay. It was exciting. It was like, oh, we're going to get there. And then even some of us were like, well, when we get in there, then we can bring our own energy and it will positively, you know, sort of evolve things, which is not really what happened. So anyway, it was a time of excitement and progress in many regards, but also it was, there was great violent resistance and backlash to all of those challenges that women were making against convention. So what I didn't realize is I thought I was very empowered. I thought, oh, I'm writing my own story. Like even when I got married, my husband and I, we walked ourselves down the aisle. And back then, that was weird. Your dad walked you down the aisle, right? We're like, no, we're partners and we're going to face people. So there were all these little rebellious acts that I was taking that made me feel like I was writing my own story. But in the end, I sort of became a victim of convention anyway. So when my midlife began to unravel, I realized that I have been living in a very masculine oriented way. And so then I was on the journey, and I'm still on the journey to relate to my inner feminine.
And so it had kind of like stuck with you, or you had fallen into the system without even exactly knowing it. Perhaps even sort of, I mean, I don't want to say tricking yourself, because that sounds like it's a, I don't mean it to sound like blamey. I just mean like this is what happens to us, right? Where we don't realize what's happening until it's sort of way in there.
Yes, I love that you say tricking, because Hermes, the Greek god, known as the guide of souls, and he has shown up as trickster in my midlife unraveling. I now consider him a constant companion. So I think feel like tricking. I think that's a great word to use. Yeah. I felt tricked.
Tricked by your own brain, right? It's a very frustrating feeling.
It's also being tricked by the larger culture, right? So Carl Jung talks about this tension between unfolding as your unique version of being a human being, as a unique individual, while at the same time trying to fit comfortably to some extent in the culture. And one of the things I'm on a mission for right now is, he said something not quite like this, but this is how I say what he meant, is that the fate of humanity depends upon the self-reflecting individual. So you need to know, as an individual, you have to have your own higher authority to know when you need to detach from convention. And those are not easy decisions to make.
No, and they often come at a cost. Although the cost might be worth it, it certainly can be an uphill battle, right?
Yes.
And it's true. I mean, it's interesting because we kind of live in a strange time, I would say, where there seems to be a big push for systematic change at a sort of top-down level, whereas there are some people who also believe that change rarely happens from a bottom-up approach, right? Like true change in a society has to be through individual change first, that will then manifest in the collective conscious or unconscious, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, Carl Jung did not like groups because the group psyche can way too easily become reptilian and get swept up in really crazy expressions of archetypal energies. So it is true. And I think in these days especially, and that's why I talk about my mission to encourage people to self-reflect. And that's really part of why I wrote my book, was to provide a framework, because we don't learn this in school. I think when part of graduating high school, you should already know like about your mother and father complex.
Yeah.
Like I think you should be aware of that as you go off into life. My kids do know, like they know a little bit about it. They know that they're carrying some patterns of thinking and behaving that were developed because of their response to having me as a parent and their dad as a father. So we haven't really been educated to have a framework to self-reflect. So that's part of what I wrote my book.
Definitely. And it's also really difficult to do, right? Because it makes you look at who you are and what you've been doing. And that's often not something that we want to look at because it's painful or it's traumatic at that sort of extreme. But even in the less extreme case, it's like you really have to be willing to confront, yourself, and not even perhaps your parents or your society at that stage, but it's a hard process to do, and you need to be willing to do it, right? It can't be forced upon you.
Yeah, and I think one of the hardest things to do is to reintegrate your sad or wounded inner version of you, your inner child, because there are things that he or she holds that are very painful, and you've put them in a closet, which means you've really detached from a really important part of you.
Yeah.
And also, the things that are in your unconscious are often very positive things that you don't want to claim for yourself. So it's not only, well, I need to take back my projection and find my own judgmental self. That's hard enough. But also, there are potentials laying in your unconscious that you have not claimed because of various reasons. So, there's so much treasure. And I think, which is why when I work with my clients, I have them start looking at their life as a story or a Netflix series. So at a certain point, in order to survive my midlife unraveling, I had to have a sense of humor about it. So I was so amazed at what was happening in my life. Not always good amazed. Like, really? This is the movie I'm living right now? I never knew I was going to be, married to a person that did that. Like, I just never saw that coming. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it's hard when, you have to face that reality and, know that to some degree it's whether you like it or not, your responsibility to deal with it, right? Even if you didn't mean for it to happen. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and this is where archetypal psychology is really useful, and James Hillman is the founder of archetypal psychology, is that you can drown in your own stuff. So therapy helps, of course, right? But a lot of therapy isn't really getting at these root issues. But if you can imagine your life as a story over there, as a novel or a Netflix series or a movie, or you can take a part of you and personify it as a villain in a Marvel movie or a superhero, then you can get some space from that material in your life, and it makes it easier. So that's the approach that I use with my clients is let's not be that serious about it, because our stories are kind of amusing too.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I find the humor in everything, and sometimes other people don't like it so much, but it's never inappropriate. It's just a different way of dealing with things. But that exercise is very interesting. Like, one of the things that I've done in my own sort of therapy is this exercise of imagining your inner critic as something sort of next to you, right? And it's very interesting to hear what people respond to that, because, you know, you often don't feel it as, I mean, you don't think about it as like some big monster or bully or something like that, or a specific person even. But as soon as you try and color the picture, all of a sudden you're like, well, this is the thing that this is what it feels like is happening to me, right? And so it really allows you to kind of be like, oh, I can see that now.
Yes, in fact, now I think this is part of the purpose of what happened to me, but my midlife unraveling coincided with this irrational calling to study depth psychology. There was a synchronistic event. There was oh my gosh, I have to have that. I don't know how. I don't know how it's going to happen, but I just knew it was like an answer to something. So I had the benefit of studying depth psychology and actually living the concepts in real time. But to sort of point to what you're saying in a real example is, in the beginning of my education and my unraveling, there were two voices that came to the surface. There were two characters. So we could look at, you know, all these different drives inside of us. We can look at them as characters. And one of them had been there all along. And I had some colleagues do what we call active imagination, where I tried to actually have a conversation with this voice, this character. And when they asked me what he looked like and what he sounded like, it was a he. And I said, you know, he's a lawyer. He keeps walking back and forth. He's dressed in a suit. It's a dark suit. And he's just like making his case. Now, I had automatically assumed he was a critic and a judge. That's what my ego said this voice was. But no, it was more nuanced than that. And when I said, hey, who are you? What are you doing here? Why are you bothering me? He literally said, I just want to make my case. And you make your choice and I'll be okay. But I just feel this need because I needed this inner lawyer all my life to protect me. And what he was worried about when he came, his voice got louder, is I had this other energy and I didn't really know even what kind of shape to put it in. It was a childlike energy. So I, at that time, was reuniting with my inner child, who had sort of been like, I had to grow up really fast. So she was sort of in the closet, right? Well, all of a sudden, when I surrendered to my falling apart, she was like, I need to play. I'm coming up. So I started feeling like these urges of playfulness, and I wanted to do cartwheels, and I had gotten swept up in this, my first post-divorce romance with a guy that was 17 years younger. And so my inner lawyer was worried that I would go too far. Because what happens is when you do find this piece of you that hasn't been allowed to be expressed, it often will come out in a really exaggerated way because it's compensating or overcompensating for not having a voice. So I had to come to have a relationship then with my inner lawyer, who once I listened to him, he went away. He went away for like a long time. And then all of a sudden during a stressful time, you know, he would reemerge again. So this is how I came to integrate and have better relationship with different pieces of me.
Yeah. And I mean, excuse me, it's fascinating that, you know, we do have these parts of ourselves that, you know, are there that we can sort of willfully shut down sometimes not. But it's interesting that, you know, you had these sort of at least two different sort of sub-personalities. What did you call them? Characters?
Characters.
Characters that, you know, emerge and have their own unique persona, or maybe that's not the right word because that's Jungian has a different word of persona, but they have their own unique characteristics and wants and needs and thoughts to some degree. And yet it sort of feels like it's part of you, but it's also a little bit separate from you because you're in this position of being able to evaluate or engage or disengage. So it's really a complex system of different sub-personalities or characters that sort of exist, and we have to sort of learn how to navigate dealing with those, especially with ones that are, you know, not so nice, or that we don't want to deal with, or that are, you know, wounded, like the inner child. And you know, evidently not doing so is worse than facing, you know, the pain of it, because it just progresses.
Yeah, and this is the balance between the feminine and masculine again, and the partnership with the ego. So as you can see, I had to become open to having a Now, I used to walk around the house talking to myself anyway, so it wasn't that much of a stretch for me to start having conversations with my inner lawyer.
Yeah.
But you know, that I was in the feminine realm, I was in the unconscious realm, and the unconscious, you know, that communication style, that language is just really different. But then, so the ego part of me then is the one that can go, oh, what is the insight I'm getting from this? Okay, so the point of that exercise then was, oh, I have this child part of me that I didn't realize. I thought I was having fun in my life. Like, I was not, I'm serious, but not overly serious. But there was this part of my life that was really had been buried. And with her was this creativity that then ended up also being unleashed as I came into better relationship with my feminine and with my inner child. It surprised me. Did I ever think I would write a short story called The Fantasy about a literal fantasy that tortured me? Never. Yeah. So yes, when you talk about, we can kind of, yes, they're part of us, but in order to relate to them, we do need to be in partnership with our ego, our intellect, so that we can find meaning. And then that meaning should lead to different approach to life, or a different attitude, which Carl Jung called the transcendent third. That when you deal with those opposing.
Hello. Sorry, I think it just froze for a sec. Am I still here?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
I can hear you.
Okay, I can hear you too.
No, that's okay.
Just like 10 seconds. So sorry, you were saying the transcendent third.
So yeah, so this idea that when my inner lawyer was a little bit in opposition with my child, right? Because he was not used to my child playing, and my inner lawyer was afraid that, oh my gosh, this is a 6-year-old. 6-year-olds don't have any self-control, right? So he was afraid that I was going to, and I really did do a couple crazy things. Like in my 50s, I stayed out and, you know, got drunk on a Wednesday night and went into work with a hangover. So my inner lawyer was a little bit in opposition with my inner child. But because I developed a relationship with my inner child, allowed her to play, said, inner lawyer, you can like take a little break right now. Then I came into a better balance with those forces. Now, how did that affect how I approached life? That is the point of all of this, is that it changed and upgraded my attitude about life. So only when you can hold that tension between those two things, then you automatically get a third. And it's something that is sort of a mixture and coming into relationship in a more balanced way with those things that were once in opposition.
Right. So it's about finding that balance or that midpoint, and that probably changes. You know, it's never sort of exactly static. And, you know, one of the things I liked about Carl Jung was his idea that we're forever developing and growing, and that there's no end point per se that we can reach. And so it's always about, you know, accepting yourself for where you are, knowing what's going on, but still realizing that there is still something in you that drives for more, right? Whether it's more understanding or more relationships or better this or whatever it is, right? It will probably be different for different people at different points in their life, and that's fine. Keeps you on your toes. You know, it's never a boring day, but it's a really interesting
approach. It's like a bottomless pit.
Yeah.
It's like a bottomless pit. So when I got my PhD, I recalled that saying, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same thing. It's so true. Like,
About yourself.
People are like, oh, you have a PhD. And I'm like, I just feel like I know a little bit about some stuff.
Yeah.
That's it. And it's the same thing with the unconscious.
Yeah.
Like, I could study my personality type for the rest of my life. It's never ending. The unconscious personally is a bottomless pit.
Mm-hmm.
Like a well, actually. Like a well where the water is way down deep.
Keeps going. Keeps giving, right?
Yeah.
Bottomless pit seems to sort of like take away. The well's a better one because it's like you're always getting nourished. Yeah. But so in terms of like, you know, understanding how our unconscious communicates with our conscious self, you know, a lot of it is through images, symbols, dreams, fantasies, you know, not so languagey based, right? And that is also something that I wanted to ask you about in terms of how do you sort of advise people to make sense of those kinds of things if they're sort of just starting out with, you know, they're like, oh, they have this recurring dream that they, you know, I mean, not specifically asking you for exact dream analysis work, but just in terms of, you know, how do we start to make sense of what these images mean to us?
So the first thing I would say is that image is the language of the psyche, the soul, the unconscious, but image isn't just visual. Mm-hmm. So yes, there are dreams, there are symbols that you're like, what does that mean to me? There are synchronistic events. I call them impressions because, for example, an emotional reaction to something is an image.
Right.
So when you emotionally react in a way that's not just kind of neutral, there is something to explore there in your unconscious. So that would be the first thing that I would say. And also experiences. So the experience of watching a film, there's a whole field of Jungian film theory. And a lot of my midlife, finding meaning in my midlife and coming into relationship with my feminine was done through my experience with films, specifically superhero films, which is really interesting. I actually write a lot about that. So the first thing I start with is, okay, what's a general framework for just working with your unconscious? And the first step is just to be curious. Mm-hmm. So it's to notice things you haven't noticed before. And it could be something silly like, oh, it says 1111 on my clock. Why did I notice that? And then I got in my car and it was like 4444. This has happened to me recently. So, okay. I don't really know what that means, but the first thing is to just notice things you haven't noticed before. I just saw 5, 10 white cars drive in a row. So notice dreams. Mm-hmm. Dreams are a great way to start. And also if you have obsessions, like obsessive behaviors or obsessions with Netflix series, because you can work film images the same as you can work dream images.
Right.
So then what you do is you just notice. It's like intelligence gathering. You notice and you make observations and you find themes. So journaling is really important when you're working with your unconscious, but not just a written journal. And I use a Word document and I type a written journal and an image journal because sometimes you can't find words for what's happening. And the unconscious can speak directly onto the paper in the form of coloring something or drawing something. So this is how you begin then to find themes and patterns. Oh, water keeps showing up in my dream. Or I found myself journaling. I went back and I read the first month of journaling and this word came up 50 million times. That is sort of a prompting from your unconscious to explore that thing. And then you're looking for metaphors. You're looking for the symbolism. Where is this kind of dynamic? And I can talk about a specific dream too. Mm-hmm. Where is this dynamic showing up in my life? So that's how you connect the synchronicity or the dream to what's going on in your life. Where can I feel this same dynamic? Oh my gosh, it's in my job. I didn't realize that I have been suffering in my job, but I feel like I can fix it. And it's just, no, I got to leave now. And then finally, the last part of it is, okay, what does this have to do with how I need to change my attitude or my behavior or how I feel about something so that then, I change my life and come into a kind of different relationship with my outlook about my life. So then when it comes to, all right, so now let's work a dream. And I love working specifically with people, recurring dreams, embodied dreams, and images that evolve over time. An embodied dream is a dream that leaves you with, like, it's embodied. Like, you feel it in your body. Most dreams, you kind of wake up and you're like, oh, you can look at it as if you're watching a movie, right? Yeah. I'm watching me. I ran through the forest. A bear was chasing me. But an embodied dream that I had, for example, that came to have greater and greater meaning with me over time was I was in this relationship, my first post-divorce relationship. I'm swept up in amazing desire I never felt. This happens a lot to women who get divorced in their 40s and 50s, apparently. And the next day, we're going to go on a hike at a state park. So that night before, in my dream, I was in a bathroom in a state park. And, those bathrooms are concrete. It was dark at night, and there's just steel and concrete. I was done going to the bathroom because I had lots of other dreams about going to the bathroom. That's a whole other thing. But I was done, and I got up, and I couldn't see. So, when you're sleeping at night, and your eyes can kind of get used to the dark and you start to see something in the dark. Yeah. Nothing. In this dream, nothing. I felt my way to the door, meaning I need to use my feminine is part of what it was telling me. I couldn't see clearly. I felt my way, opened the door, and then I found myself rolling backwards down a hill. Now, you would think I would be terrified. It's pitch black. I'm rolling backwards down a hill, but it's kind of like slow motion. And then I stop. And then I keep rolling, and in my dream, I can feel a warm breeze. I can feel the smell of fall. I can feel swirling, falling leaves from the tree. And I have this visceral feeling of feeling safer than I ever have in my entire life. And when I woke up, that feeling of safety was so real that I tried to linger in it as long as I could. And for months, I tried to re-experience that feeling. And so that told me that there was something really powerful going on. I didn't know what it meant, so I drew it. And I drew myself falling backwards down a hill. And then I added a pair of hands. That was not in my dream. And the hands for me represented this coming into relationship with the archetypal mother, because I had a difficult relationship with my mother where this feel somebody's got me. Yeah, the safety. I surrendered to it. Now that is an experience of an embodied dream. And what it was telling me, which I didn't know until like maybe 2 years later, is that you're going on a journey that has to do with your feminine. Your intellect, strong, not going to help you. You're going to have to go with it, go with the flow. You're just going to have a really intense journey, but you're going to be, okay, I gotcha. And it was a prophetic dream. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Right. So how you would work that practically, which I share in my book, is you would pull out the images. So what are the images in that dream? There's a state park. There is a bathroom. There is darkness. There is a warm breeze. There is a feeling of safety. There is tumbling. There's probably 50 images in that dream. For each of those images, and usually I would start with the one where there's the most, it's the feeling of safety was the one I started with. Then you begin by finding associations for that image. Right. So when I recall that feeling of safety, it made me think or feel this. And you keep going back to the image and finding those associations. And you could do lots of images or just do one. And then after you feel like you've exhausted those images, then you ask yourself, where is this relevant in my life?
Mm-hmm.
And you might not know for a while, but that's the process that you begin, that you start. So you take a message from the unconscious,
Mm-hmm.
and you look at the images and you work with them and you relate to them, and then you find the metaphor falling backwards. So sort of how I explained the eventual meaning,
Mm-hmm.
I was calling on all kinds of metaphors, right? And then in my life. And then at the end, how did that impact behavior? And what it did is it helped me develop the capacity to feel awkward, because also being in the feminine is not being in control. It is feeling awkward. And this man, every moment I was with him, I felt intensely awkward. But that is what allowed me to feel things that I hadn't felt before. So that's just an example of sort of an overall framework for working with your unconscious.
Yeah.
And then here are some practical steps for how you would work something like an embodied dream.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And what's interesting is like that it's so uniquely personal to you, to anyone, right? And it's not like you're looking for specific images to mean exactly this because it's common. It's which may be true, but generally speaking, in it, you know, you want to know what it means to that person. And then there's also this element of, I mean, for lack of a better word, faith, that your unconscious is trying to tell you something, or it's trying to figure something out, and you just have to go with it and see what it means, right? And especially in like your case, it took a couple years to even figure out what it was really all about. You know, it wasn't like an immediate, just like, oh, resolved, or I get it. But, you know, you continued with that on the sort of good faith that it was actually meaningful and important to you.
Yeah. And one of the things I tell my clients, because dreams can be scary, and messages from your unconscious, and, you know, disproportionate emotional reactions and fear, that's scary, right? Your unconscious is always on your side.
Right.
Always on your side. So it's an assumption. That's the trust that you have to have, is that, for example, if you had, one of my clients she was about to turn 40, and she had a dream that a grizzly bear was mauling her family right in front of her.
That must have been fun.
Now, she thought it was about her family. Yeah. Terrifying. I said, this is not about your family directly. This is about a part of you.
Right.
So your unconscious is always working on your behalf. And I think that helps when you have that trust and when you have that assumption. It gives you the courage then to explore images that feel, because the reason we feel fear of the images or awkwardness or shame or vulnerability has to, you know, always goes back to childhood, right?
Yeah.
It's something really old that you have to rework in your new life
and integrate. But so how does that account for this sort of sense of that sometimes happens where you feel like you've, betrayed yourself with how you see things, right? Is that just because it's a stuck pattern that you've been living through, perhaps because of childhood issues, or maybe most likely because of childhood issues, and so you sort of establish yourself in this pattern of behavior or thinking, and then you try to deviate and it doesn't go so well for you, and then you feel like, well, you shouldn't have done that, but really maybe is it because if you look deep enough, you'll find that, you know, your unconscious is trying to get you away from that pattern, even though it's uncomfortable and new and vulnerable and upsetting, right? You kind of still have to have that trust that it's going to be tough to do, perhaps, but it's for your own good, right? It's not working against you.
Yeah. Yeah, and, you know, betrayal is such a judgmental word. And sometimes I think how we value things, I think we have to also be really open, right? Because our unconscious is going to bring us experiences that help us grow. So, for example, I came to think about soulmate relationships in such a different way because of this relationship I had with this man who I write about in my memoir. It was It was so crazy and so ironic. And thank goodness I was studying depth psychology, because I was like, wow, something's going on here, but I don't know what the meaning is yet, but I'm going to go with it. And I often had to look up and go, I don't know what to do. And then all of a sudden I would be like, oh, okay, there's the answer. All right, I got to see this through no matter what happens. And with that relationship, which lasted 22 months, lasted about 30 months, but 22 of those months we could not really be free to live life in the way that we wanted to. So not that we couldn't see each other. Really, really crazy story. It's going to be a Netflix series maybe someday. But it was during that time that I came into where I learned how to surrender to myself. Mm-hmm. And every time I did that, I was rewarded in the form of pleasure. And so part of my opposing forces that I had to deal with, so I said feminine and masculine, but that also manifested as my relationship between my sexuality and spirituality. Right. Which was really not, it just was like, it wasn't in sync. So the more that I surrendered to my awkwardness, the more that I surrendered to, okay, somebody's got me, I'm trusting in this situation, I was literally rewarded with pleasure. And to the point where I couldn't distinguish whether this pleasure was spiritual or sexual. It was both. It really connected. So that relationship ended. But it was because I think I learned how to be in better relationship with my feminine and myself and my intuition. When it was clear it needed to end, it still broke my heart what happened. Yeah. But I was like, it is so clear this has served its purpose. Right. That is a soulmate. A soulmate isn't like somebody who you just always feel in sync with. A soulmate is about growth and soul making. And that man is still a friend. I'm helping him publish his own book. And I just came to see encounters with people. So I guess what I'm getting at is the agenda. How do we define what's good? Right? So
right, because we don't know what's good for ourselves.
Right. Is it bad that my relationship ended? Well, to my ego, it was. Things didn't go the way that I was supposed to. But if I would have tried to force that relationship, then I wouldn't have had the next experience. So it's not easy, though.
And you could have suffered a great deal.
It's hard.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, for sure. And we
that's
don't know
when my
what we
sense
need.
of humor came in.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry. No, you're absolutely right. The sense of humor makes it more bearable. But it's interesting because, I've often thought about how when we want something, we're not, at least I can speak from my experience, I'm never exactly sure if it's the right thing for me. I think I want things, but oftentimes I can't think of a concrete example right now, but I've had this pattern of I want to do this, and then you do it, and you're like, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. But you learn a lot from it, right? And so what I'm sort of getting from what you're saying is that, the soulmate dynamic is more about how we influence each other's growth and development, right? And it's a way of looking at relationships, romantic or otherwise, as two souls connecting and developing each other or growing with each other, even if that time is a very sort of tumultuous or difficult period. You do learn a great deal. And it's true. I mean, you often hear people say that, the quote unquote bad things that they've been through, eventually they're grateful for because it taught them a great deal. Now, it's not to say that you sort of want it to happen again, but given that it did happen, how do we approach it now? And I think it's a very, profound way of looking at things. Is all of these experiences I've had, good and bad, have made me into the person I am today and will continue to do so, and just sort of keep it in the appropriate context or frame.
Yeah, I love how I think Oprah says this, where she's like, Well, sometimes doing the right, you listen to your intuition, you do this thing, you try it, it doesn't work out. Oh, but did it clarify what I really want?
Yeah.
Yes. So sometimes you need something to help you clarify what it is you really want, because maybe you think, like you said, you think you know what you want, but it turns out, and this is a silly example.
Go for it.
I left my Midwestern hometown, left my young adult children. That was a really, 2 years ago, really big deal for me. It was terrifying. I had anxiety for a year. And I always wanted to live in a beach town. My other sister lives down here in Florida, so I'm in Jacksonville Beach. And I got down here, and the first summer, for 5 months, it was 85 degrees every single day. I was like, oh, I thought I wanted to live in this weather, and it turns out I really don't. So I'm glad I signed only a 12-month lease. I always thought I wanted to live on the first floor. I got the third floor. I'm like, I never want to live on the first floor. What do you mean? So it's very silly examples, but I could have felt really bad, right, about it, about my choice. I came down here, but guess what? I always wanted to live in a beach town, and now I've lived in a beach town for 2 years. It doesn't matter that now I discovered, well, I really want to go back to a different kind of climate, right? It doesn't invalidate anything, just like a failed marriage. I was married for 24 years, and it took my children some time to realize that the ending of the marriage did not validate the marriage.
Invalidate, yeah.
Right. It just, I find meaning in my experience of that marriage.
Absolutely. And there's also the sense of you moved to the beach town, but had you not, you might have always in your head been like, I should have done it, or it would have been, I didn't follow my dreams, or all sorts of regrets that people come up with. And now well, actually, I'm glad I did do it, because I realized this isn't exactly what I want, and I'm not stuck, wishing for it. But, given that so much of our unconscious is unconscious, it's a bit sort of self-explanatory, but given that situation, we don't really know what we want exactly right all the time. And if we did, I'm not sure that that's even better, because then you would get what you want and that would be the end of it, right? It's a constant process of growth.
Well, and remember, when we say, I know what I want, that's our ego talking.
Yeah.
Right? And our ego has an agenda. And the ego's agenda is to play it safe. The ego's agenda is for you to fit into the collective. It's not about being authentic at all. We need the ego to keep us safe, but we need to really, if we want to unfold, we need our unconscious to help us lead the way to really unfold. Because most of, and even science now says this, that unconscious forces direct up to 95% of who we are. Yeah. The decisions we make, even who we're attracted to, our personality quirks, our desire for geography for a particular client. So much, most of who we are is prompted by our unconscious. So if we don't explore our unconscious, we're really foregoing the exploration of most of who we are. Yeah,
which is a little bit of an uncomfortable truth to learn that, I think, that most of who you are is not within your control, because we tend to think of ourselves as being able to control things, and to some degree we can, but you only need to sort of think about where your thoughts and feelings come from to realize, well, you don't really know. They just kind of happen to you in response to all kinds of things, or even to each other to some degree. But, it does feel weird when you conceive of it like that, but with some, working through an acceptance of it, it's actually a liberating truth, because then you're like, oh, well, actually, I can learn now what the situation is and find out what is best for me, or where I'm going, or what do I really want that will, fulfill me the most and give me meaning and pleasure and joy and all these things. I mean, along with the other stuff, but at least you have that to buffer it. right?
Yeah, and it does induce a lot of anxiety.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Because when you're used to, because I was a control freak, I call myself a recovering control freak, and people who
Sure.
need to know and plan, it's because we're insecure inside. So it's quite a journey, and I think that's why I find my story intriguing, is that anxiety is also a way our unconscious communicates with us. What does our anxiety want for us?
Yeah.
So
What's it
the way
saying?
that I started relating to this phase of my life, because I had never actually felt anxiety before my midlife unraveling, reconstruction, and then when I picked up and left my hometown. That's really when I started feeling anxiety, because I didn't know what I desired anymore. That's really weird.
Yeah. The
Like,
uncertainty.
I didn't know how to answer I didn't even know how to answer the question. If time and money weren't an issue, what would you do? Other than make sure I could spend more time with my kids, and I'd love to be a bestseller. I do want to encourage people to self-reflect. I got no bigger, there's nothing bigger really that I don't. So that's like disconcerting to not even really know what you want. But then that means that you're open and you're receptive to a more transcendent force. So whether it's your higher self, capital S, or whether you want to say that's God or creative intelligence, I now know that I'm not alone. And I now know that the creative source energy wants to flow, or the archetypes want to flow through me, mix with my unique experience of being human, and create what only I can create in partnership with creative source. So then that's comforting.
And how long did it take you to get to that point? Well, I suppose your whole life, technically, but I mean, was there a sort of definitive point where you kind of realized this, or an experience that you had?
I think probably when I moved, probably when I picked up, like, being in your hometown for your entire life and then leaving it is really interesting. Really, I mean, I also had to go through a lot of feelings of shame. So, for example, as my marriage was sort of falling apart, things were falling apart, I was studying depth psychology, which was liberating for me. But at the same time, I got this amazing job, 6-figure job with an amazing nonprofit. And it was wonderful. It was like a gift from the universe, which it was, because it provided me financial stability, because I had been a consultant. And then after 18 months, I hated it. And I was like, oh my, no, unconscious, no. And I knew I had to start transitioning away. Literally, I knew it was my unconscious saying, well, you were only going to be here for a little while. Now you got to go out and do these braver and braver things. So I walked away from that job and dragged it out. And I was so blessed. I had this transition period. And then I couldn't find another job. So I left a job, didn't have a job. I started doing really weird things to earn a living, like rehabbing houses for somebody. I became a bartender for 7 months because I told myself, yeah, I just want to go to an island and be a bartender for a resort and just,
yeah, why not?
have a little bit of money I wanted to be so small. I went through this phase of wanting to be so small, but I had this persona that now was being dismantled. I had been a community leader. I had this job. I had fit into this club. And then my unconscious was like, I couldn't do it anymore. I literally left a job that it was torturing me. And as soon as I left, my anxiety went away. So I kept understanding my anxiety was pushing me to do things that were dismantling this old way of existing in the world. And then I had to sell a house that I couldn't afford anymore. And then I, had to take some money out of my IRA. There was so much shame. And I'm like, why? It's my money. Like, why? So this is when I could laugh at myself. Yeah. Why am I feeling shame by doing these things? But that's part of the unraveling of your old way of being. So, that's why having a framework, I think, is really important. And like I said, therapy is one thing, but having a partner to help you, because you can drown in feelings of anxiety and even some despair and dread, and all those feelings are very helpful if you know how to develop a relationship with them.
Mm-hmm.
But who teaches you how to develop a relationship with your anxiety?
Yeah,
Besides depth psychologists.
Yeah. No, you're right. And it can be, the end of people, and it occasionally is. And it's, really sad, but, most people we don't know how to regulate our emotions or know what they mean, or that they're trying to tell us something. And it often feels counterintuitive. I just want to check, do you have a few more minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. Just because the hour's up and I was just checking.
Oh no, this is all I got today.
Okay. Awesome. But what's really interesting is what you're saying about this experience you had with anxiety, where, you were in a situation and you knew you needed to leave, but that gave you tremendous anxiety. Maybe it didn't give it to you, but you were experiencing tremendous anxiety because of this situation. Now, it's obviously, there's a lot of fear about what's coming next. Am I doing the right thing? All those kinds of, thoughts, which are fairly rational but scary and make more anxiety. And that would often stop people from doing it, right? And it seems like it's counterproductive, because it doesn't seem like the anxiety is just what do you make of that?
Yeah. In this particular case, sort of the tipping point for me, because here's where my inner lawyer was saying, just get through your PhD. Mm-hmm. This job makes you a lot of money. You don't hate the mission, but there were this is when Hermes the trickster was totally like tricking me. And so I was at a conference, and I was really I was trying to push this down, this welling up of hatred for this job that was a gift 18 months earlier and that I loved.
Yeah.
And the last night of the conference, I had a dream. And the dream was, I was in a coffee shop walking around. I had 2 levels, and then I walked out to the driveway, and I looked in the sky, and I'm like, what's that dark cloud or swirling something? And it was a flock of blackbirds that now were coming at me.
Uh-oh.
And I'm like, and I ran to my car, and I got in my car, rolled up the window, and that was the end of the dream. So now blackbirds are messengers from the gods. And blackbirds in particularly carry mysterious messages that if they come to you, only you know what they mean. But it was threatening for me. Now, I got in my car and I was safe. What is that? Persona. That's my persona. So I got back into my persona. These birds want me to do something, but I'm like, no, I'm too scared. I'm in. But that morning when I woke up, I had so much anxiety that I never felt in my life before. I skipped out on the last day of the conference. I didn't even tell anybody. I packed up and I was like, went to the airport. I got on the plane, and I have always had, I call it a womb complex, where I feel suffocated. I need space, and I need an aisle seat, and I need an escape route everywhere I go. Mm-hmm. But typically on a plane, if they sit me next to the window, I'm going to make it. Yeah. But I literally
There's
was
also
on
no
the
escape
verge.
route on an airplane.
Well, that's true.
Not jumping out.
But like I can usually psychologically go, I'm fine.
Yeah.
I can get through it. But in this case, I almost had a panic attack, and that had never happened to me before, to the point where I had to ask the flight attendant if I could move. I said, I'm sorry to be a baby, but I literally think I'm going to have a panic attack. That anxiety would not go away until I had a conversation with my boss that I have to start transitioning out. And I was afraid to have that conversation because I thought they were going to be like, oh, go, you're out of here. And no. And as soon as I had that conversation, they're like, well, yeah, you can go 3/4 time. And okay, the anxiety went away. So to deny the anxiety and to continue to push it down was not doable for me. It wasn't sustainable. Like I literally almost had a panic attack.
Yeah.
But you're right. Then what did I have on the other end? I had different kind of anxiety. And this is where Hermes showed up again, because I'm like, what am I going to do with the step psychology? What kind of job can I do? And but Hermes would keep throwing me little bones. I could pay my bills. I had savings to use, right, et cetera, as I was going to have to live in this uncertainty. So I told myself, oh, I get it. What I'm being called to do is develop a capacity to be secure in an insecure situation.
Yeah, to venture forth into the unknown.
Oh my gosh,
with courage.
But geez, being tortured. But I don't know. I had to do it. And by then I had made enough decisions where I was like, I made the hardest decision of all, which was to get divorced.
Mm-hmm.
I never thought I'd ever do that. There would ever be an excuse to do it. And I had to do it. So there was so I had already done something that I just felt I got to the point where I have no choice. I just have to do this. So, and then Hermes showed up again because I started getting really desperate. And then I started applying for jobs that were just like that one I hated.
Right.
And in one of the interviews, the chair of the board, after we were done, fantastic interview, he says, "You're really enthusiastic." And I'm thinking, oh, this is going well, right? Like, that's a compliment. He says, the ED you're replacing and the staff, they're just the opposite. I just don't see how that's going to work. You're too enthusiastic.
That's such
and I went home and I'm like,
thing to say, but okay.
Yes. And I'm like, Hermes the trickster. Okay, I get what you're saying. No, there's no going back now. It was clear. My unconscious was not going to let me go back. I had to go into this realm of the unknown. Yeah.
And it's fascinating because so often we have to do that in our lives, not knowing how it's going to go, but without another choice. And if we don't listen to it, the more it weighs on us until we do, or until something basically forces us to do it. Right.
Oh, yes. We either get sick, there's an accident, there's an affair, your spouse or whatever. Like, your psyche will orchestrate events to bring your attention to
crazy.
Something. Yeah.
I don't mean crazy in a bad way. I mean, it's crazy how that actually happens. And you just can reflect on how you've orchestrated things unintentionally, but really you kind of knew about it. It's strange, but it's the two sort of components that I think are also important here is, this idea of when you're dealing with yourself, basically, to do it with compassion, right? Because it's very easy to also, be mean to yourself, basically, or undermine or do all the things that you don't want to be doing, and it just makes it worse, right? And it's kind of the way to approach it is with compassion. But one of the tenets of compassion is what Paul Gilbert calls wise action, right? Which takes courage. And it's that, being compassionate to someone else or to yourself isn't just about empathy. It's about being able to know what needs to be done and doing it despite the fear or the anxiety or anything like that. And, that's the courage piece, is that it's not going to be easy necessarily, but you do need to do that, because otherwise it's going to just be a lot more suffering, and it's going to happen anyway, right? As you say, your psyche will figure it out for you.
I'm glad that you brought up compassion, because that is the reminder I have to give my clients. That's the biggest reminder, is because everything they feel, they automatically judge. And compassion. And what's interesting is that when you have compassion for yourself, you feel better, and you automatically have more compassion for others. And that's just a great outcome all around.
And what's also interesting is the sort of neuroscience of it, which explains that when you're feeling compassion, either for someone else or yourself, it's the same neurochemistry going on, right? And it's the same feeling. So people who can't or who struggle with self-compassion, which a lot of people do, it's okay to start off with being compassionate for yourself, for someone else, and just sort of working your way backwards. And that's where some things like, this is not a psychological theory, this is just what I've sort of thought about, is like, I think part of the reason why people like the wounded child metaphor is because you can project it outside of you. And so you don't have to do it to yourself. You can kind of picture the child and be compassionate towards them as you would towards any child, and still get the benefit of feeling their compassion. And then some kind of integration happens at some point that I'm not exactly sure how that works. But it's a fascinating element. And, you know, even in your dream where you fell into these hands, like that's the sort of safety or soothing systems that are being activated, right? And you can also like learn how to do that for yourself when difficult things arise. And it's just a fascinating approach. But you're right, because lots of people, the first thing that happens, a feeling comes up or a thought, and the first thing is just judgment, right? And almost always negative judgment, because we have that negative bias, which is always fun. Yeah.
We didn't really talk about active imagination, but you know what image came up for me when you're talking about, you're so right. Like, it is easier to feel compassion for a small child, that part of you, if you imagine it, that part of you is a small child. You really could personify any part of you that's difficult as like a puppy dog.
Yeah.
Think about that. It doesn't matter what images you use. It's really about the compassion part of it. And we didn't really talk about active imagination, but I do a lot of active imagination with my clients, where we either visit an inner child, or we plop back into a memory and see where the imagination or where the self takes you. And it always adjusts the memory, not adjusts, but continues the memory in an empowering way.
And is that because you got it that way, or is that just sort of an inevitable
It is.
consequence?
Active imagination is amazing. It's, image, right? So it's your unconscious speaking. You don't make up your imagination. Like, the things that just come, they just come. Your ego can get in there though and mess with it, which my ego is really quick. But I had an amazing experience with one of my clients who had a memory that she didn't even really understand how she felt about it. And it had to do with her friend's father, who for some reason she just feared for really no reason. It was just the energy. So I said, and he drove her home one day and she was terrified in the back seat. And I said, well, let's go back there. And she's in the back seat, and I'm asking her to really look at this guy who's driving the car. And, and she said, I feel like if I don't see his eyes, I feel safe. And I said, well, move over in the seat and sit behind him. And she moved over in the seat and sat behind him. And it made all the difference. That's all she had to do. And that was sort of like a boundary issue. And the way that this all manifested in her real life is that whenever she's someplace, she just feels like everybody's looking at her and judging her and laughing at her. And so when she takes her children to the store and kids, misbehave, automatically she just feels like this. So that little active imagination where her unconscious just took her, just like, well, just move over. Now I kind of I don't think I told her to move over. I said, well, now I didn't tell her at all. Actually, I said, now what is your imagination telling you to do? What is your imagination taking you now? And I think the other thing is, because when you're doing active imagination, you are calling on something, a kind of wisdom that you don't feel is you. So you're also open to it, right? So, so she didn't say, well, she would never have thought to move over, but she was listening to another part of her who said, well, move over.
Move to safety.
So it's really, so I think that's why, the kind of, I don't know, active imagination is just mind-blowing.
Yeah, definitely. And also the fact that we can intentionally create and recreate, emotions and things like that by just thinking about stuff. I think it's very underappreciated in everyday life. But, that's what we're doing. We're working and telling people what's up. But anyway, listen, Deborah, this has been a really fantastic chat, and I really appreciate it. Please promote all your stuff. Where can people find you? It'll, of course, be included in the link below, but yeah, go for it.
They can find everything about me on my website, which is DeborahLukovich.com. So it's DeborahLukovich.com. And right on my homepage, they can find my podcast, which is called Dose of Depth. And that podcast is where I encourage people to explore the deeper meaning of ordinary life events through stories, conversations, and education. So sometimes I'll read a chapter of my book, or I'll read a short story or a blog post, and other times I'm interviewing people. And then also they'll find my book, so they can click right on the image. That'll take them to Amazon if they want to buy a copy. There's 46 reviews, so they can read some really amazing reviews. And then they can also get to my blog page. My blog is almost a documentation of my midlife journey, but it's storytelling, but it also infuses sort of this depth psychology lens. And at the end of every blog post, I have a try this section. So they're also instructive and provide, because I'm on this mission to help people self-reflect. And then what else? Blog, podcast, book, I think. Oh, and then I am a coach. So I'm a depth psychology coach. So, which means what I'm doing is I'm teaching people the language of the unconscious. And people come to me for the widest variety of reasons. Most recently, my newest client said, I want to write my story. I'm ready. And so much trauma, and just was never really honest in therapy, but there's just something, she's ready. So my coaching is sort of a fusion of exploring some things through a depth psychology lens, and then her writing. So awesome. Yeah, so people come to me for all kinds of reasons.
That's cool. Yeah, and I've read and listened to a bunch of your stuff, so I can recommend it highly.
Thank you.
Thank you again, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you so much.
Take care.